Cultural Resource Laws and Practices, 4th edition, Thomas King, Chapter 4, Managing Impacts on Historic Properties, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. What it is and how it works. If the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, is the broadest of the Cultural Resources Authorities, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA, is among the narrowest. It requires federal agencies to do deceptively simple things. Deceptively simple things. Sorry about that. 1. Take into account, unquote, the effects of their actions on the district sites, buildings, structures, and objects included in or eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places, that is, on historic properties. 2. Afford the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation a reasonable opportunity to comment on such actions. Over the last 40 years, an intricate process of project review has grown from these two requirements. Section 106 in historical perspective. When NHPA was enacted in 1966, one of its authors, the late Robert R. Garvey Jr., became the first executive secretary, later executive director, of the fledgling Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, ACHP, and had to decide what Section 106 meant. How were agencies to take effects into account? What did it mean to give the ACHP a reasonable opportunity to comment? At the time, another question was easily answered. The only thing agencies had to give the ACHP an opportunity to comment on or take into account were effects on places already on the National Register. Section 106 at the time referred only to district sites, buildings, structures, and objects included in the National Register. Nothing about unregistered but eligible properties. Since the register was as new as the ACHP, there weren't many places on it, so Section 106 business was slow for a while. However, a national register was assembled by the National Park Service, NPS, using its existing listing of National Historic Landmarks, NHLSs, and its inventory of buildings documented by the Historic American Building Survey. Agencies began finding that they did have Section 106 to deal with from time to time. But what did this mean? Based on what seemed to work in the first few cases in which the ACHP took part, Garvey and his colleagues, then embedded in NPS, decided that taking into account, unquote, meant figuring out what effects an agency's actions was likely to have and considering ways to mitigate any effects that were adverse, since most agencies didn't know beans about historic preservation. This should be done in consultation with people who did know something about it. The ACHPS's small NPS-based staff and the newly created state liaison officers, later state historic preservation officers, or SHPOs, finally, because the rationale for even having a Section 106 was that preservation was in the public interest. Consultation should involve the public. In the late 1960s, the ACHP put out non-binding procedures for Section 106 review. President Nixon's Executive Order 11593 added clarity to the ACHPS's role and brought eligible but enlisted historic places under the Section 106 umbrella. President Carter gave the ACHP rulemaking authority through the backdoor mechanism of a presidential memorandum on water resource management. Congress eventually made this authority and the inclusion of eligible properties official. It also separated the ACHPs from NPSs, giving it independent status. Section 106 procedures were issued as regulations in 1979 and revised in 1986 and 2000, with further adjustments. In 2004, they're codified at 36 CFR 800, that is Title 36, Part 800 of the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR. Here is the section of 106 and HPA, should you wish to go through that. 36 CFR 800 today. During the Reagan administration, 36 CFR 800 was the subject of regulatory reform. This was when I was employed at the ACHP, and it taught me a lot about how Washington works. The revised regulations that emerged reflected a lot of compromise. We were able to preserve the public consultation-based process that Garvey and his colleagues had invented, but controls were inevitably placed on to protect project proponents against rapacious preservationists and the public. The Reagan-era regulations worked all right for a dozen years, but in 1992, after NHPA was significantly amended, the ACHP began revising them again. The ACHP had great opportunity in the environmentally oriented Clinton administration to prescribe a simple, balanced, effective process, but it insistently ducked this opportunity, instead tinkering with the 1986 regulations guided by no evident philosophy or vision. Adjustments were made here and there to serve the interest of whoever was pushing the particular adjustments, if such adjustments raised howls from people who felt they went too far. The ACHP made more adjustments to satisfy the aggrieved parties and then more to satisfy those unhappy with the adjusted and adjustments. The result is something of a camel. But in 1999, the revised regulations were issued, promptly challenged in court, revised some more, and reissued with minor changes. In 2000, more litigation followed, leading to more tweaks in 2004. Some conventions. Before we begin to look at the regulations, let's be clear about some conventions. Terminology. When I refer to the regulations, unquote, or the Section 106 regulations, unquote, I mean 36 CFR 800 as revised and published by the ACHP in 2004, where it's necessary to contrast them with earlier versions. I'll refer to them as the, quote, the 2004 regulations. By Advisory Council, or ACHP, I mean the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. By SHPO, I mean State Historic Preservation Officer. By THPO, I mean the SHPO's equivalent in an Indian tribe. The regulations routinely refer to the SHPO, THPO, recognizing that these officials fulfill the same roles within their respective jurisdictions. I'll follow the same convention. The regulations also provide that where an action has effects on tribal lands, that is, lands within the exterior boundaries of a reservation, and there's no THPO, the tribe has the same rights as the THPO. They don't thereafter refer to such tribes. It's understood in theory that they're included in the term THPO. I'll follow that convention too. So understand that whenever I refer to the THPO, I mean THPO or tribe without THPO with respect to impacts on tribal lands. Clear as mud? The regulations use the term agency official for the person in the agency that's doing Section 106 review, who's responsible for making the review happen. I don't follow this convention. Instead, I just refer to the agency because compliance is a corporate endeavor on the assumption that many readers are employed by agencies or are thinking about or at least can imagine being thus employed. I also just call the agency official you or sometimes we or us. Case study. I'll illustrate each step in the process of the with a real world case involving a place called Medicine Bluffs in Oklahoma, and with other cases where they can help clarify the process and its pitfalls. Each time I use the Medicine Bluffs case, except at the very end, I'll pose questions for the reader's consideration to help make sense of what's just been discussed. Some of the questions will have pretty obvious answers and others won't. Answers will be discussed in the prelude to the next use of the example. This will be the end of Chapter 4, Part 1. Thank you.